Good evening. Hey, welcome everyone. So glad that you could join us. We are going to be looking at an exciting topic tonight. We had a guest on some months ago, John Burke, Imagining the God of Heaven. That was an amazing interview. We have Pamela Pyle on tonight. She is an MD and she's going to share her insights into near-death experiences. Now, what I find really exciting about this is that, as we get closer to the end, I feel like God is kind of pulling back the veil, like he's allowing us to have just a few snapshots, maybe some video, if you will, of people's experiences as they've gone and they've come back and they've shared what's going on. Now, it's a little bit weird sometimes because of AI, and some of the AI videos are getting pretty amazing. And sometimes we don't always know what's real, what's not, but it's exciting when we have someone who's in the field who can share her insights with us. And so we're expecting her. She's not here with us yet, but we're hopeful that she's going to make it with us. All signs say that she will. But let's consider this. And of course, I have my amazing, intrepid co-host this evening, Joel. Hey, Joel.
I am muted right now, but I just unmuted. I'm supposed to be working with her to help her join the show.
All
So,
right.
have we ever had
Fantastic.
this problem before? Yeah.
Sometimes we do. Well, in any event, let's think about it. Okay, God creates the Garden of Eden, right? Everything's going hunky dory, right? Until Adam takes a bite of that fruit, and then this world falls into decay. Well, that's kind of a problem. And ever since then, of course, we've all been dying, and people have gone and they've apparently seen what is beyond. I think about that time when Paul talks about him being stoned, and then he tells us later that he says, I know a man, I don't know if it was in the flesh or out of the flesh, in the body, out of the body, who went to the third heaven. Third heaven apparently is, the other side, right? So the second heaven, or the first heaven, would be, the blue sky where the birds fly. The second heavens would be sun, moon, and stars. And then the third heaven would be where God and the angels and presumably the bad guys all sort of hang out and do their stuff. All right. We'd call that the other side of the veil. That would be called, the spiritual realm. And so Paul tells us that he went there, and he says things were so amazing that he can really not even talk about them. He says it really wouldn't even be legal to talk about them. Now, I don't know if he was talking in a godly sense that it's illegal to talk about them, but I think it was more of a phrase that he was using to describe how he just couldn't do it justice. That's probably what we would say today. I'd tell you, but my words wouldn't do it justice. I think that's really what he was trying to get at. And fair enough, right? We have these incredible images and reports of what people have seen on the other side. And I'm kind of getting excited, but it's kind of this double-edged sword, because you're like, boy, the more you hear about it, like, geez, I'd love to be there really quick. And we just skip to the end and go there directly. But here's what I do know. God is using the challenges, the trials, all the tough stuff in this life to form us, to shape us, to help us to grow into the people that he wants us to be, and ultimately that we want to be. Look, life is full of lots of punches, right? And you're going to get punched in life. And so we can learn to either lean into those and appreciate the lessons that we can learn, or we can always find ourselves being the victim and always going at, flying away, trying to escape from the tough times. God allows us to go through the trials. And I'll be the first to admit, I don't enjoy the trials much of the time. But when I look back, and I've kind of gotten past that place of a little bit of bitterness, if I'm honest, and I say, okay, now I'm in a place where I can appreciate that lesson. Maybe it took me 20 years to get over a lesson, right? Because it was painful, maybe 30. But eventually you come to this place where you have peace and you understand the greater good. And that's what the Lord is allowing now. And it's really interesting, from when we had, of course, John Burke on, and the many reports that I have witnessed either by video or I've read about, or I've heard about, it's really been incredible that so many people who do not come from a Christian background, maybe they are Jewish, maybe they're Muslim, or they're Hindu, and they or Hindi, excuse me, they they die and they have this experience. They come back and they tell us, they're like, "I saw Jesus." You're like, "Well, that's interesting, right?" And what they're seeing, it's not a Baptist Jesus, it's not a Messianic Jesus, it's not a Catholic Jesus. This is a being beyond imagination and comprehension. We spend so much time, especially here on the Prophecy Roundtable, right? We spend a lot of time thinking about, well, the end of the world. We think about the return of Christ, and we all have these different opinions, and we sometimes squabble and sometimes, you know, defend our positions. But when the Lord comes back, we're not going to really care about any of that. And I'll tell you, I think that we're all going to just put our hands to our mouth and say, "Oh, oh, okay. There's a lot I didn't understand." So I just, I'm at the stage in life where I want to see more of who God is. I want to see his heart. I'm less concerned about the particular details. I mean, those still have a place in our life for sure. But I've also come to realize that we're never going to agree on all the particulars. And maybe there's something bigger that we need to see. Maybe we're so zoomed in that we can't see
Pamela.
what we need to see. So
Okay, let me.
I'm delighted to say that Pamela is now here. Welcome, Pamela.
Thank
We're so glad that
you.
you could join us.
Oh, good.
I
Yeah.
am so sorry, guys. My flight was late, and I am not in my normal technology place, and not that I'm good at technology anyways, but I'm stuck by my daughter's house in Atlanta, so my deepest apologies for being
No
late.
worries. Well,
We're
we're glad
thankful
that
that
you're
you're
here. We're
joining us.
already live, so we're glad that you could join us. And we are excited to hear about your experience with near-death experiences, especially as an MD. We think that's quite exciting. So maybe kind of give us the background, like how you got into this, what inspired you to write about it, and what do you find, I guess, most surprising about the near-death experience itself?
So I wouldn't say that I focus entirely on near-death experiences. It's as much near-death awareness and some of the things that occur right at the end of life,
Mm,
in that transition.
mhm.
Um, but I've read a lot on near-death experiences, and my husband came to faith in a near-death experience.
Wow.
Um, and one of the people that I have just really respected from the beginning of her writings was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and who wrote On Death and Dying. And she, are you familiar with her or her work?
I'm not. No.
No, and Doug and I love NDEs. And so we're watching videos all the time and reading books. He has the John Burke book, and we found out about you and thought we need first person or second person witnesses of what's going on rather than AI driven stories. So help us with Miss Ross.
Yes. So I'm going to give you a personal story first because it's the most meaningful to me. And then I'll give you a little bit of background of other experiences around NDEs, and then a little research that has been done on it. And I know you talked to John Burke, and quite frankly, he's the expert on, or one of the experts. There's a lot of experts on it.
Yeah.
But so my husband, we were 30. I was 29, he was 25 and got married, and neither one of us were Christians. I had not been exposed to the church, and he had grown up a little bit in the church, but had a little bit of church pain from, not a little bit, a lot of church pain from some hypocrisy that was surrounding his dad and being a deacon and then leaving their family. And so really was not engaged with the church at all when we got married, and had never really accepted Christ, although he said, I went to the front a couple times just so they'd stop playing whatever song.
Amazing
Just
Grace.
as I am.
That's
Oh,
Just as I am. It goes
if he was
on and
Baptist,
on.
if he was Baptist, it was just as I am.
Yeah, it's everybody.
and the
It
funny
just
part about
plays in my head.
is everyone that grew up in that kind of environment, they
Oh
were
yeah.
like, oh yeah, we would take turns. Yeah. But anyway, so that was his experience in the church, and obviously mine without any church experience. And we got married, and 2 years into our marriage, he was in a pretty bad accident and had a lot of blood loss. And, we called ambulance. I was riding with him in the ambulance, and I truly didn't think that he was going to survive. He was, they were giving him fluids, wouldn't get blood products till he got to the ER. But he just was unconscious, which requires quite a bit of blood loss to become unconscious. And so we get to the ER and ultimately get him to surgery, and I'm waiting. And from his perspective, and he has no concept of how much time was in that gap, because it was several days later before he was actually awake and was able to describe what had happened. But essentially, he said, I had this sense of an awareness of self, an awareness of my own existence. Probably, in reflection on the way he described this sense of awareness, an awareness of his own soul. And he felt a darkness, very, very cold. He really couldn't see anything, but it felt like his existence, his soul, was being pulled from him. And he had enough of biblical knowledge from when he was a child to know that he was dying, and that he was not dying in faith, and that this was most likely hell. And so the only scripture that he could remember, from being a child is every knee will bow, every tongue confess, every knee will bow, every tongue confess. And he just cried out to the Lord in that time, begging to give him more chance, more breath, and that he knew now that Jesus was who he said he was, but he was experienced an existence without God's presence. And if you think about it, here, even in this world, as terrible as things can be and are, we still have a sense of God's presence. And in this place that he was at, it was the absence of even an awareness of God. And so he just kept crying out to the Lord And he said it was like suddenly, and it was almost like a reversal of everything that had happened before the act, or up until that moment, that clearly Jesus was responding and saving him. Um, and it was like if you were to watch a movie backwards and fast, he's reliving everything that had happened from the moment he felt the coldness to the sense of trying to figure out where he was, to knowing where he was, to reaching into the recesses of his memory, and then crying out to the Lord, and the existence that was being pulled. And he said it wasn't like a certain area of his body, it was like if you were to take all the bones out of the body all at once, it would have no structure. And it felt like that. But then in the reversal, sped up, it was like he was being rebuilt. And so he did survive the surgery, and he did live to tell about this experience. And the thing about it, I knew my husband before this accident, and I knew my husband after this accident, and he was completely transformed. And while most wives would be really happy about that, um, I wasn't a believer, and so I first I didn't believe it. I thought, well, he's just had anoxic brain injury, which is a brain injury from low blood. But he just truly was transformed. I mean, he started reading the Bible. He just changed. And we had gotten married 2 years previous, and after whirlwind courtship, and he was a wild and crazy guy, and I I was drawn to that, and all of a sudden he's this not wild and crazy guy. So I was, pretty shaken by it, but also still trying to explain it medically, so much so that I had him evaluated at the university that's a couple hours from where we live, and all the neuropsychological testing, and EEGs, and so forth. And the doctor, came to me and said, Dr. Pyle, there's nothing physically wrong with your husband, but he believes he's had a spiritual experience. And to me, Jesus was really Santa Claus and Tooth Fairy kind of myth. And it's only when you watch someone for a long period of time and realize there was a change. And unlike so many NDEs where they're changed because they see the light, they feel warmth, even if they're not saved or have belief in Jesus, they or any faith. The very common thread is this experience of being comforted, seeing the light, an expansion of senses, and his was not like that. So from that perspective, it's a very personal experience of near-death NDE in my life very early on. And I really didn't associate what that was until I began writing about um, dying and death and heaven and near death awareness. And in that journey of um, studying that, I really spent a lot of time first with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying. And just for background, she was a psychiatrist, atheist, very well known, well respected, spoke all over the world, and was the first person that really brought light to the fact that we need to care for those that are dying. And so, if you've ever heard of the 5 stages of grief associated with dying, that was something that she discovered in her research and went on to write many, many well respected books. But the most interesting part of her story is she came to faith later in life. And she wrote a series of papers on NDEs and also a research study on NDEs in children. And it's very hard to find this set of papers. But because she had done that, she actually was rejected by the academic community at the time. And this was in the 90s. And she went on to pass. But her work in NDEs was so pivotal in my mind of refreshing the stories that I would hear from those that, particularly after resuscitations, because all of my work has been in hospitals, in acute care, or trauma coming through the ER. And so there were a lot of times that people were resuscitated, and with modern medicine, we were able, in many cases, to bring them back from the brink. And the common theme when someone could remember, and I would say it was probably 25% of the time for those that I saw, and they just stand out in your mind. I've practiced medicine at this point by 35 years. They stand out for how much they change the individual. Now, I'll have to say that of those that I've listened to and heard their stories, it was more in line with what is commonly reported, a positive experience. The most common thing is, beyond seeing the light and that aspect, is seeing relatives that are deceased and having just an awareness that they were in a different place, that they felt safe. They didn't want to come back. Even though, when a lot of times they'd be on a ventilator for 3 or 4 days before we were able to get them off the ventilator, and then they're retelling these stories. And at that point, they're glad they're survived because their family members are there, but they're so excited, to tell this experience that is clearly not a dream. One, because they're on medications that are amnestic meaning that you're not dreaming during intubation on these medications, but the clarity of the experience was more clear than any other type of dream, even if you weren't on medication. And they remembered it from the original time of the cardiac arrest or arrest on the table. Sometimes even in deep comas, they'll have that experience. It doesn't have to be in the event of someone flatlining. So that's kind of my experience. What? Do you have any questions?
Yeah, Doug.
Oh,
Oh, Scott was on for a minute there. He's driving right now. He has a medical emergency, and due to HIPAA laws, we can't talk about it. But anyway, do you understand that better than we do?
Yes.
thank you for sharing. That is just absolutely fascinating, and it's really interesting to hear about your husband's experience. But I think at the baseline, this really helps people see that, okay, there is something beyond. Not all of these experiences are the same. They have a lot of similarities, as you pointed out. How would you say your husband's compares to a lot of the, I don't know, whatever you want to call them, but just some of the other, are some of the similarities, some of the contrasts? What really stood out in your mind?
And I honestly think this is more of a bias in reporting than actual a difference in what happens. There are very few reports of people describing what would be hell, if for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that there's many that die without faith. But I think there's a bias in two ways. One is that these are people that are returning that God has chosen for their return for a specific purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And almost all of them, as they're reporting, what happened, their lives are changed. Everything about their life changes,
Yeah.
And the other is, if you think about those that have experiences like my husband's and survives, maybe they survived, but it was only because of a medical intervention. Or maybe they survive and, like my husband, had that experience of salvation, but they really don't want to admit to anyone else that they experienced hell. So I think there's a natural bias to have less reported negative events than positive events.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, hell's not something you want to tell people. Yeah, I didn't make the cut. I mean, I've heard some people say that they actually went to hell, but given some time and some circumstances and some praying, they came back, so they were able to tell their experience. But I don't know, for me, it's given a lot of color to some of my theology. Having been a pastor and a author, theologian for many, many years, I think we can kind of get stuck in our silos. We get stuck in our ivory towers of, we read the text and we really try to understand the text, but because we have zero experience with this thing, it's hard for us to fully understand all the implications of what the afterlife is like. I mean, like, and let alone all of them. I mean, we barely get, a tiny fraction, I mean, we're just kind of left with a lot of bad theology and then a lot of murky experiences that we can't quite make sense of 100%. So that's why I really appreciate some of these, because it gives us at least some insight as to what is beyond. And, there's so many cases when people have gone and they've described the New Jerusalem. They maybe didn't call it that. They called it the holy city, or the white
Golden
city, or
Yeah.
the golden city. I mean, there's different terms for it, but they're all describing it. It's got 12 gates, and they see these big pearls. Some describe these streets of gold. Some describe all the gorgeous flowers, and just this feeling of electricity. But they all, the ones that I've at least encountered, they talk about how they really encountered Jesus, and that was very surprising to some of them. So I think, I guess what I appreciate is when I hear sort of a quote unquote hostile witness, say an atheist or somebody that you wouldn't expect to come back after a near-death experience and say, I saw Jesus. Like, what? Like, what are you talking about, dude? Like, you don't even believe in the guy. Like, yeah, but I met him. I mean, to me, that's kind of that's powerful evidence, that there is something. So you take a few grains of salt with their testimony, but still, it is what it is. And so you've worked in ER, and you've encountered, I mean, you've kind of, not always a near-death experience, but you've obviously had lots of encounters with people. I mean, does anything stand out where, somebody maybe flatlined or came close to it, but they had some kind of experience, and that, they were able to share that with you? I guess, like, are there any, special ones that really stand out that you remember, that you can share some of the details with us? Or
There was a young boy that was involved in an accident and had head trauma. He was 12 or 13, and he came in unconscious, pretty significant head trauma. Was immediately rushed, to the neurointensive care unit, and they basically, because the trauma was so extensive, and it actually was a gunshot wound, they didn't give any hope for the family. And in fact, by the time the larger family got there, and the pastor, they were talking about him being an organ donor, even though he was not brain dead, but thought that was where it was going. And I mean, the organ team procurement team was coming, and but he would still have this very periodic brainwave, and so he wasn't meeting the criteria for brain death. But it was so bad that they didn't even clean his head wounds. And so I'm following him over a period of time, and he really got to a point that, well, after about 5 days, and the neurosurgeon makes these decisions about head wounds, not me. I'm an internal medicine doctor, hospitalist, and they finally cleaned his head wounds, and we had discussions with the family about, because he was having no neurologic reflexes that would suggest cortical activity, which is the higher brain function, and talked to the family over actually, it was a couple of weeks after cleaning, and the family, via the doctor's recommendation, said that he most likely would be in a vegetative state, but had not met the time requirements.
Mm.
But the doctors recommend removing him from life support because there was such extensive brain damage. And the family continued to pray.
Mm.
And the mother had made the decision that she was ready to let him go. But the father said, no, he's going to be saved. And there was this push-pull between the two parents and actually two sides of the family. He's still not waking up, minimal to no reflexes, no conscious activity, even when he was not, sedated. He wasn't sedated at all. And the decision was to remove him from life support,
Mm.
expecting that he wouldn't take a breath at all. And in fact, they had done certain, we did, they're called ventilation sedation retreats, where we take them off any kind of medicine. And in this case, he was on none of that because he wasn't fighting the vent. And he wasn't, when we stopped the vent, he wasn't breathing on his own. So we felt that when he was extubated, the tube coming out, that he would pass because he wasn't taking any spontaneous respirations. But in reality, when he came off the ventilator, it was the first time he breathed on his own. And that young boy, I mean, he was a fighter. He, over time, very slowly, and this was weeks to months, getting about 6 months, and he started to wake up.
Wow.
And he ultimately went to rehab and got home, was able to go home and able to join his classmates. He had a fair amount of physical issues, but miraculously, his brain function was intact, which is, I mean, it's a miracle of that. But he remembers seeing his family kind of in these arguments while he was there asleep, unconscious, still on the ventilator. And how he just kept thinking, he was looking at the top of his dad's head, who was always like sitting at the side of the bed with his head leaning on and he just remembers seeing his dad's head and bowed down in prayer over him. And he wanted to comfort him so deeply. And he just, from his perspective and from his memory of that, was this sense of, I'm so glad my dad is fighting for me. But his perspective of the room was always from seeing from above. But it also seemed chaotic to him, other than his dad's figure over his bed. And that is, in fact, how his dad spent many of those days for months.
Wow.
And his mom did too, but it was a different kind of grieving that she was going through.
Mm-hmm.
She was grieving, believing he would wake up.
Yeah.
And she was grieving, believing he wouldn't.
Wow.
Um, so he finished college,
Wow.
Oh, good.
wrote a book. So part
That's
of the theology around death and dying, and this is kind of an interesting fact, is Christians as a demographic are more likely to choose aggressive end-of-life care.
Mm.
And you wouldn't think so. We shouldn't fear death. But the reality is there's this sense of, well, if I don't put them on machines, or if I take them off a machine, then I'm not protecting the sanctity of life. And the second thing that's a theology issue that tends to keep those decisions difficult is waiting on a miracle.
Mm.
And every miracle that I've seen has been like this young man, after the machines are turned off, he takes a breath.
Mm-hmm.
My son was born blind and now is a computer engineer. It's just, it's not through medicine that miracles occur. And they're very unpredictable. They occur to the believer and the non-believer alike.
Mm. God sends the rain on the just and the unjust. Is that right? Yeah. How do doctors deal with? How do they deal with some of these? I mean, I would say atheistic doctors. I mean, I understand. I mean, you got to be skeptical. You can't believe everything that you hear. But in your experience, how have some of the other doctors, or even you, kind of felt about some of the near-death experience claims?
Most people don't do a lot of research into it.
Mm-hmm.
And they therefore think that it's still anecdotal stories from,
Mm-hmm.
a couple of cases that were stood out very significantly. And so they don't really explore it as a scientific study.
Mm-hmm.
If they did, I think there's a lot of incredible studies that reveal that it is something, it's very real. I don't think we have all the answers, but I'll give you an example. And I mentioned Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, her kind of landmark study in one of these papers that was rejected by the academic community was NDEs in children.
Mm.
And each of these experiences, children could very clearly describe what had happened, describe, an accident, knowing the color of what people were wearing. You would think in a circumstance where a child might be afraid that they would want to see their parent. If they're dreaming of comfort in terms of while they're in this experience, but they never describe seeing their parents. It's always those that have died. And these are young children, young as 4 and 5, that are giving this testimony. So there's a lot to that, and I'm sure if you've read any of John's work, the studies around the blind and those that have seen while they had the experience and then and some blind from birth, and then being blind when they returned. But have you looked into or discussed at all what's called near-death awareness and terminal restlessness? Because to me, it's just as interesting and also almost more accepted in the medical community of true events. So,
Have you ever heard of Nurse Julie on YouTube?
yes, she's a hospice nurse. Mhm.
Yes, she is. She describes that all the time, and she's hands-on, and people are dying or near death, and she just goes through the process. And I should tell you that my mother ran an extended care wing for about 25 years, so she would take the people in, and they only died. That was the only way they were leaving. So she just, excuse me, she experienced that, and and then my father would bury them. He was a pastor, so that was the process. We were just used to it. We would hear the stories and go through her experiences.
So in medicine, and there wasn't terminology for it when I was going to school, and it's really just in the last 10 or 15 years that they've put these two terms associated with the dying process, one of which is near-death awareness, and that can occur in the actively dying phase, typically in the last 3 days, most commonly in the last day, sometimes the last hours. But it's characterized very much like the majority of NDEs, where the patient becomes calm and is comforted.
Wow.
It's describing it's so close to an NDE, but they're still on this side.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Describing heaven,
Yeah.
describing Jesus, talking to family members as if they're in the room that are deceased,
Wow.
talking about packing their suitcase, they're ready to go, and getting on the train, predicting the exact time of their death.
Wow.
But the consistent feature of that term, near-death awareness, which again is a medical term, is a sense of peace. The opposite side of that is terminal restlessness. And that is, it's much like it sounds. It's patients are agitated, they're crying out, they appear fearful. This is in medical literature. They're seeing snakes and black things crawling on the walls, heart rate up and down. And medically, when we see anyone uncomfortable, and as they're dying, we first look, is there a physical cause? Are they in pain? Is there a catheter issue? And then we look at mental. Is there a reconciliation that needs to occur? Is there some family member that we need to get on the phone? Some sort of unmet need on this side. But then if you have gone through that, the next thing is this a spiritual matter? And when you consider like that description of terminal restlessness, it's very much like hell.
Wow.
And so these two competing ends of life experiences really reveal, the veil becomes thin.
Mm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I've had a patient that was comatose for several days in a row, having agonal breathing, which is right before death, then sits up in bed and claps his hand 3 times and says, Jesus, 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 and lays back and expels his last breath.
Wow.
What did they describe that again? Where they have that rush, that energy rush, as they're close to death? Nurse Julie talks about it all the time. She
Yes,
expects it.
yes, a burst of energy.
Burst.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and it's typical.
It is, but it's so interesting in a faithful person because
Okay.
they are truly, they'll describe heaven. In detail, all the things that you are hearing about in NDEs, they're just seeing it and not coming back.
Mm-hmm.
And
Hmm.
it's very, it's such a beautiful thing for family to be able to experience that with their loved one. And, I'm sensitive to those that are in support of physician assisted suicide because of the suffering. But I write about, as a Christian, I'm not for it. And I'm trying to make the case of there's so much that occurs in the dying journey that is natural, that God uses to reconcile families.
Mm-hmm.
It's an opportunity for evangelism like no other. You'll be able to. I'm sorry, are you hearing that background?
That's fine. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I am using my microphone, but it's, I wasn't expecting that sound in the back. I lost my train of thought.
That God uses the experience of death to reconcile
Oh,
families.
yes. And then, when we're suffering, and especially when we're dying, and we are getting closer to death, there's a sense of peace. And the closer a believer gets to their final breath, they become more peaceful.
Wow.
It is 100% positively true. And so getting to see that as a nurse, as a doctor, as an orderly, as a family member, you're testifying to your confidence in your destination.
Mm.
And that's just a beautiful gift to give your family.
Wow.
And then the last moments, those near death awareness, like Stephen in the
Right.
book of Acts, he saw heaven. He had a near death awareness experience.
Mm-hmm.
Paul probably had a near death experience. It's They're different, but they're like on the same theme. What I'd love to know, with your interest in it, is have you looked at some of the research from other cultures
No, not really.
around NDE?
Briefly, just not really, but please enlighten us
The
if you.
closest that I've come is Evan Alexander, who came out of it a non-believer. Went in a non-believer, came out that way. And that's like another culture to me. I don't know how you can go through that. And he had, his brain was dead. There's no doubt about it. But go on and tell the other cultures, please do.
So there there's a lot of international research on this, not just Christians talking about it. And very interestingly, depending on where you are, where you live, your experience is culturally relevant to your faith background. So, what you envision heaven to look like might be different, but the common character is Jesus.
Hmm.
And you might not have ever had, any of the things that we see Jesus in if you're living in Asia, and have not had exposure to Christianity. But their near-death experience always reports a faith figure that is in their minds. They call him Jesus.
Wow. That's a pretty good name for him. I mean, I've come across some testimonies where, they are not American, they're not Christian, and they very much experience Jesus, that they're often surprised. I mean, they're not like when they die, what I've heard is that when they die, they just know that it's Jesus, right?
Yes.
Even though their culture and their language and all of that, their religion or lack of, would not in any way suggest that they should encounter Jesus.
Right.
But when they do, they just know. Like, he didn't have to say, "Hey, I'm Jesus. Nice to meet
Yeah.
you." Like, they're just like, oh, that's
Yes.
Jesus. And he's a somebody here. He's like the somebody,
Right.
and they just know, right? And that's what I think is so powerful. He needs no introduction. He's the name
I know.
above
Exactly.
every other name, right? That's what's so amazing about it. It's so cool. So,
And what's so interesting, and what I find interesting, is this has become really a hot topic, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Oh, totally hot. Yeah.
And it's not that it's occurring more; it's probably being reported more.
Yes.
More, it's definitely being studied more in a scientific approach. But at the core, we all want to know that what we believe is true. But I could go and never hear a near-death experience, never see near-death awareness. And I'm not special in any way, shape, or form. But when someone asks me, well, how do I know that I know that I know about what happens after our last breath? And I'll say, well, it's the evidence. And they're often, especially an atheist, once the apologetics argument or the near-death experience are, descriptions, but it's Jesus in my life. And there are so many things that have happened in my life. And again, if anyone really examines their faith life, it would be statistically impossible if it weren't for Jesus being who he said he is. And we use evidence to guide medicine. And it's the overarching evidence. And it's the same with when we're looking for that very precise answer. I know that I know that I know. I start looking back at that happened, this happened. It's my personal experience with it. And while others will be convinced or maybe at least a seed is planted by apologetics. It's almost like you have to cross into the step of faith, or remember that it is still faith,
Hmm.
and then the evidence comes through experience with him.
Yeah. That is so beautiful how you put that.
So if someone in the audience had a parent or a relative that was dying right now, what would you recommend for them? Your book, obviously, if you would state what your book is, and then any other books that might apply, or any other advice that you would have for them to process this.
Well, I'll start with my book. It's called Anticipating Heaven.
Okay.
And unlike Imagine Heaven with John Burke, which is an amazing book, it walks patients and their families through the first time they get a diagnosis with these are the questions to ask, these are what to expect at the hospital, how to get your voice heard, how to navigate healthcare, how to plan for the unexpected and the expected, and then how to have hope through it all, because no matter if you have a near-death experience or you receive a miracle or you're brought back from the dead like Lazarus still died. So the most important preparation that you can do with your loved one is be confident and help them be confident of their destination. And Billy Graham, and I love the way that he says this or said this. One of his favorite things to ask are you prepared to die? And that's a self-reflective and for anybody.
Yeah.
But he also followed up with the question, with the statement, if you're not 100% sure, if you're know that you know that you know, let today be that day and let now be that time. And even if someone says, well, I'm a Christian, I don't really remember my day and time, it doesn't hurt to do it again. But it sure will comfort those around you. And
Sure. Yeah.
listen to your loved ones that are dying. They have so much wisdom. They have so much wisdom.
Yeah.
And they want to share it. And all you have to do is be a active, attentive listener and ask them, what do you want me to learn from when you were in your 20s? And there's something those that are aging, those that are ill, those that are suffering and dying, they begin to lose a sense of their own value. And what you're doing by being a good listener and asking is you're showing that their life had immense value and you want to learn from them. And let me tell you, there's a lot of wisdom from those that go before us, always.
Question came up. Have you ever seen someone do a 180 in beliefs after witnessing a near-death awareness experience or a near-death experience?
Yes. And it's honestly, I would say the majority of near-death experiences that I've seen, they don't know precisely, like they don't wake up and go, I'm a Christian now. But they wake up with the intense desire to seek truth about what they experience and who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And we know that when we seek him, and so it might not be immediate, but it's really soon after. And
Wow.
they're very, they're not just pew sitting Christians. They're telling their experience. They're like, they become evangelists.
Wow. Wow. How can you not, right? I mean,
I
that's
know.
an incredible experience. Tell people where they can get your book again. Tell them the name and where they can get it. Yeah.
Yes, it's Anticipating Heaven. My website, drpamela.com, has it, Amazon, any bookseller.
Okay. Awesome. Well, Dr. Payne, thank you so much. We really appreciate
Thank
you
you.
coming on. This was wonderful. Dr. Pyle, excuse
My
me.
apologies for being
Oh,
like,
don't worry.
No.
It was great to have you on.
Yeah.
And your husband is still a believer to this day, or is he more of a believer now?
we are on fire for the Lord.
Okay. Okay.
That's good. Well, it shows. I mean,
Good.
yeah. So, Dr. Pyle, thank you so much. It was a
You're welcome.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Truly
Thank
a pleasure.
You guys are bringing like this to new people.
Yes.
And if that makes people seek the Lord,
Yeah.
wow, that's amazing.
We want them to have those happy thoughts as they leave, a comforting thoughts. You know, we don't want them scared half to death. So good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, everyone, we're so glad that you could join us. Hey, if you found this value in this content, make sure to subscribe, like. If you want to help support it, you can become a producer. You can go to patreon.com/Doug Hamp, and you can choose the amount you want to give, but it really does help us keep the lights on, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you so much. Always glad that you guys can join us. I'm not going to run the thing I've been running for my book. All right. So go check it out. Regenesis Code. If you haven't read it, I think you're going to love it. So check it out. God bless you guys. And of course, stay in the word. Be encouraged. Good night.